Thanksgiving. We all know that we're supposed to be thankful. And of course we have these cultural rituals and this season to mark Thanksgiving. And we're taught to pause and maybe inventory all the things that we have. And ostensibly, this will make us feel all warm and fuzzy inside. And then we can go on, living life. The problem with this setup is we all know that we don't always get that warm, fuzzy feeling. And this Thanksgiving exercise that we have oftentimes just makes us hungry for more things to put into our inventory list of things we have and we possess. And to make this even more complicated, from a very young age, we're often admonished to be thankful. We're taught to act thankful so we won't be perceived as rude. Please and thank you are magic words in our culture. So it's this social pressure. And coupled with this social pressure is this very strange underlying cultural refrain that goes something like, be grateful because it could be so much worse. It's a strange way to get to gratitude. It's like, just imagine all of the other catastrophic scenarios. Just imagine all the other people suffering in the world. It could be worse, so don't you feel grateful now? We have this very strange relationship with Thanksgiving in our culture. So that if someone says, be grateful, we immediately feel this social pressure to act appropriately. We feel like we have to generate a list of everything we possess. And then we have to bizarrely imagine the worst case scenarios that somehow we've avoided. Be grateful, we say, in our culture. And the result is often like a wave of social anxiety and some shadowy shopping list. This cultural language of Thanksgiving. Hey, good morning. This cultural language of Thanksgiving, it's really a strange relationship. It makes it really challenging to then grasp the spiritual vocabulary of Thanksgiving. Because in the spiritual vocabulary of prayer, Thanksgiving is the absolute inverse of what our culture demands of us. In the spiritual vocabulary of prayer, Thanksgiving is not a social act of recognizing what we possess. Thanksgiving is a spiritual awakening to our participation in God's miraculous love. Paul was writing about Thanksgiving. Paul writes about Thanksgiving as a staying awake force. Paul writes, persevere in prayer. He's writing the Colossians. Persevere in prayer, staying awake with thanksgiving. Stay awake with thanksgiving, he says. Staying awake lets our spirits stay awake. Thanksgiving is this stay awake force that reminds us that we are miracles, swimming in miracles. Thanksgiving is this stay awake force for our spirits to remember we are participating in something spectacular. And astoundingly, Paul is dictating that line for the letter to the Colossians. He's dictating that line from prison. He's shackled in chains. This is Colossians chapter 4, verse 2. Persevere in prayer, staying awake with thanksgiving. This clearly has nothing to do with social pressure to be appropriate. Paul has been completely humiliated. He's been publicly beaten. He's been cast out of all proper society. He's saying, remember my chains in this same chapter. Remember my chains. This isn't about being socially appropriate. And this Thanksgiving is not about listing all the things that we have. Paul has lost everything, and he will never, ever get it back. This isn't about keeping an inventory of all you have. Instead, stay awake with Thanksgiving is acknowledging that there are so many things that make our spirits tired. There's so many things that make our spirits want to go dormant. Paul writes this from prison. Yes, it's really, really hard not to spiritually shut down. So stay awake. Use Thanksgiving. In the midst of all of it, Thanksgiving is this spiritual awakening force that we can use to remember that we are participating in God's miraculous love. Think about all of those things that make your spirit want to shut down and go dormant. There's so many things. Anxiety, for sure, and the overwhelming odds that are stacked against love in this world make our spirits want to shut down. Or there's the terrible news and the risk of worse news coming. And there is our experience of deep mourning and loss and mortality. And there's the long list of our failures. We all have these failure lists that make our spirits just want to shut down. Or maybe we have a list of people who don't like us. Or there's past brokenness that we haven't healed from. Or there's illness, and there's violence, and there's mental anguish. All these things that make our spirits want to shut down and go dormant. It makes our spirits want to, turn off the porch light and crank up the ambient noise machine and put on a sleep mask. And Paul is writing from prison, from this dark underbelly of society about this, about all the things that make our spirits want to shut down. And he talks about perseverance and keeping our spirits awake with this discipline of Thanksgiving. Because y'all, we have to keep our spirits awake. There is so much strength yet to receive. There is so much wisdom yet needed. And there is so much miracle that is inviting our participation. So much miracle to participate in. That's what Thanksgiving is. It's the spiritual awakening to our participation in God's continuous miracles. Jesus teaches this at one point as an exercise in counting baskets. Count your baskets, Jesus says. Remember those stories in the Gospel of Mark where Jesus and the disciples are surrounded by hungry people in desolate places. And in both instances, they don't have the necessary resources to respond. There is a huge crowd, and they have nothing to work with, and they are in a scary place. In both stories, this is Mark 6 and Mark 8, God takes their inadequate resources, it's like a few loaves and a little bit of fish. God takes their inadequate resources and multiplies them so much that there are leftovers. The first time in Mark chapter 6, there's 5,000 people, and they're a deserted part of Jewish territory. And the feeding is so miraculous that the disciples have to do cleanup. And cleaning up, they fill 12 baskets with leftovers. And then again, in Mark chapter 8, there's 4,000 people, and they're in a deserted part of Gentile territory now. And the feeding is so miraculous that the disciples have to do cleanup, and cleaning up, they fill 7 baskets with leftovers. From nothing, and from fear and anger and an absurd amount of need, somehow they end up with leftovers. I mean, these miracles are so outrageous. They're so over the top. You think, how could you ever forget it? How could you ever get over it? How could you ever know fear or want or anxiety again after experiencing something like that? Could your spirit ever doze off after that? comically, Mark tells us, that is immediately what happens. I'm immediately after this second miracle, immediately after feeding 4,000 people miraculously and having leftovers, immediately after bustling around, filling up baskets, in this repeat of a miracle, the disciples, bizarrely, are all worried about going hungry on their boat ride across the lake. They get all worked up. Isn't that just like all of us, though? I mean, how easy is it to forget that we are participating in miracles? I don't understand it. I don't know why we're like that, but it's so easy for our spirits to get drowsy. And Paul writes from prison, stay awake. Use thanksgiving. And Jesus gives this very simple instruction. He says, hey, recount your baskets. They're in a boat. Mark tells us. They're in this funny boat scene, and Jesus is giving them wisdom about spiritual temptations. He's saying, beware of the temptation of being a perfectionist like the Pharisees. Jesus says, beware of the temptation of power and influence like the Herodians. Jesus is giving them this wisdom, but Mark tells us that the spirits of the disciples are completely deaf. They're completely asleep. They are only thinking about where their next meal will come from, and they're worried about who is to blame for forgetting the boat ride bread. And Jesus looks into their sleeping spirits, and Jesus quotes the Psalms, as he often does. He says, having eyes, do you not see? Having ears, don't you hear? And then he says, count the baskets. Count the baskets. This is the opposite of counting sheep to fall asleep. Counting baskets is intended to wake up the spirit. It's counting the evidence that you are participating in miracles. Jesus asked them, how many leftover baskets did you fill up when we fed 5,000 people? And they say, 12. Which is a lovely sacred number. That's really good basket counting. And then Jesus asked them, how many leftover baskets did you fill up when we fed 4,000 people? 7, they say. Which again is a lovely sacred number. And it's really good, it's good basket counting, y'all. And then Jesus says, do you not yet understand? Don't you get it yet? And Mark just leaves the story at that. Mark just leaves it there and moves on to a story about a more acute blindness being healed. He leaves the story at, do you not yet understand? Jesus asking. Imagine Jesus asking that question and you being able to respond with, yes, I understand now. Yes, I see that we are participating in miracles. Yes, my spirit is awake. Yes, I am giving thanks. Late, as a couple of nights ago, my phone dinged, and it was from a phone number that I didn't recognize, and there was a picture of a little newborn baby. And I didn't know who it was, and I didn't know who the picture was from. And then a few minutes later, a message dinged in Spanish saying, this is our daughter, Esther. Thank you for your help. And in all honesty, I had no idea who this could be. I didn't know, frankly, and I was pretty tired. And I was also that night worried about all the remaining things on my to-do list, and I was worried about what the next day held. And by the way, like late night texts are the worst when you're tired and there's a big day ahead, you know? And you can hear in the background Jesus saying, count your baskets. And a couple minutes later, another picture dinged in. And there behind the hospital mask, I recognized one of the women that we had signed out of prison over a year ago. Recognize her behind the mask. Count your baskets, Jesus says. I was thinking back on that. It was really the simplest thing for us. It really just involved us driving down to the prison one night, signing a piece of paper that promised to keep this woman safe. And that woman The woman who'd been separated from her husband for nearly a year in an immigration prison. She was released, and she came home to our church. She stayed at our church, I think it was just a few days. And then off she went on a bus north to find her husband, to reunite with her husband. And I was struggling to remember her name. I was trying to remember what her name was, and Jesus is saying, count your baskets. You're participating in miracles, Jesus says. Her name is Mariana, and she is just a normal human, and she is a regular mother. But her life is miraculous, and her liberation was miraculous, and their reunification and this new baby named Esther is miraculous. And we got to witness just a tiny part of that miracle. And of course, the world is so heavy. And Paul says, you got to keep your spirits awake with thanksgiving. And Jesus is saying, count those baskets. You are participating in miracles. And of course, you're worried about a whole bunch of things in your little boat. And you probably forgot some of the bread. And your spirit wants to hide from all of those things and all of those mistakes and all of those anxieties. Your spirit wants to go dormant. But don't count sheep. Count your baskets. Count the evidence that we are participating in miracles. What if that was your spiritual hobby? What if that were your spiritual hobby, counting the baskets that hold the leftovers of miracle? What if you had a list that you looked at every morning? We have something like that in the morning prayer group. What if you had a list like that reminded you that you are participating in miracles? A list reminding you of the way that person made it home, the way that person was healed, reminded you of the liberation of this family, or the way that person came into your life, reminded you of that amazing provision at the last moment, reminded you of that surprise encouragement when you felt completely forgotten. What if that was your spiritual hobby? Spiritual hobby of counting baskets. What if when Jesus asked you about the number of baskets, you remember? And you say, yeah, let me pull out this list so I can be exact, Jesus. These lists, these reminders, these baskets full of the leftovers of miracles. It's not a list of things that we've gotten. And it's not a list of things that we have earned. Thanksgiving is not a social act of being appropriate, recognizing what we possess. Thanksgiving is the spiritual awakening to our participation in God's creative love. Paul says, stay awake with this Thanksgiving. And then the next time we hear Jesus talking about bread, he's holding it up and saying a Thanksgiving prayer. In Greek, it's Eucharisto. Thanksgiving. Jesus takes the bread and says, this is my body. And then he tears it up with the promise that this tearing up, this brokenness, this death will lead to a forever union, a complete communion among us and with God. And then Jesus hands you a piece and says, here, participate in this miracle. Wouldn't it be lovely to hear Jesus say that? Take this. Let's participate together in this miracle. And we say to that, amen. Which really is a fancy way of saying thank you.